all of you attendees who joined today. Thanks for taking the time to join us for this important webinar about why context matters in today's IT, specifically for IT operations. My name is Bryce Hine, and I'm Vice President of Marketing here at Rocana, and I'll be your host for the webinar. Just a couple housekeeping items. I mentioned earlier, one, we will be recording the event, so we'll be providing that link later today, so look for that. As well, please use the Q&A button. That'll allow you to ask the questions that you want. We're all on mute, so please ask those questions on Q&A, and our speakers will get to those along throughout the conversation. I would like to introduce our speakers today. First of all, Jason Bloomberg. Jason is the CEO of Intellyx, and Omer Trajman. Omer is the CEO and co-founder of Rocana. So I'll start with you, Jason. Jason's an industry analyst. He's an expert on digital transformation. He writes often about this topic, whether that's in his blog, on his biweekly newsletter, but also for Forbes. So welcome, Jason. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks. It's my pleasure.
And I'd also like to introduce Omer. Omer's our CEO here at Rocana. Omer has a great deal of experience in big data and in advanced analytics, and has spent most of his career trying to tackle super challenging issues for IT, of which total visibility and analytics and total context, those are definitely difficult challenges. Omer, maybe I'll hand it over to you. Why is total context, complete context, so important right now where we are as an industry?
It's a great question, Bryce, and thank you for the intro, and thank you, Jason, for joining me. And it's a very timely question when we think about what we see today as IT operations teams and as individuals, and what we're potentially missing and why we care. I actually read a great article just over the holidays in Network World. Has IT become too complex to manage? And I think that really kind of hits the nail on the head in terms of why context is becoming so important. If you look at how IT has been run classically, every time there's a new technology, every time there's a business need that drives deployment of a new system, the response from an operations perspective is, let's set up another monitoring system in order to track what we believe is the most critical aspects of that new business system, that new IT system. And what's happened in particular over the past decade as we move to more agile IT, more hybrid cloud, sort of private cloud, public cloud, and microservice architectures, where you have a bunch of technologies that don't operate in silos, right? A business need might be add mobile account checking capabilities, and that involves a whole host of new systems that talk eventually through maybe an enterprise bus to a mainframe, right? So you've got a whole bunch of different systems that are now interconnected to solve the business problem, and yet they're still being run from an operations perspective in these silos. And so what you find when you talk to folks on the ground trying to meet these SLAs and move faster is whenever there's a problem, whenever they're planning, they're missing context. They don't understand why a particular issue happened. They don't understand why a system went down. And so that's kind of what we see industry-wide is this massive shift that's driving a need for more context in everything IT does.
And Jason, one of the things that you recently wrote about was just the challenge around silos. I think it's very related to the point Omer was making. Could you share your perspective on that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this discussion so far has been very technical, right? It's focused on IT operations and some of the challenges that the ops folks have dealing with the data that they deal with every day. But the broader context, and context again being the theme of our discussion, is that this is part of the business challenge, right? The overall business context, whether the technology is supporting, your e-commerce process, or maybe you're doing transaction processing in banking, or maybe you're doing claims processing in healthcare or insurance, right? There is no longer a division between the business concerns and the business context from the IT concerns in the IT context. And this is really the primary challenge of digital transformation, is understanding that if we continue to run our enterprise following organizational silos, then we're not going to have the context that we need in order to meet the needs of the customer. Because today's customers require these end-to-end digital capabilities, a high performance, always on, multiple touch points, but connecting to back-end systems in real time. And we're just not going to be able to deliver customers that kind of capability unless we understand how to resolve these issues of the organizational as well as the technological and data silos that have traditionally been the way we've divided and conquered the challenges facing us. So it's a broad story, and it's great to be talking about context, because the context challenge is really this big picture that we need to work on.
And we really, I think, Jason, your point is spot on. We really see that now on a daily basis. I mean, look, just recently, last year I think it was Neiman Marcus that crashed on Black Friday or Cyber Monday. This year it was Macy's, right? So it's not because they fundamentally can't meet the needs of the business, the needs of the end customer. It's not knowing what's required. So one of our customers, for example, not one of those two, but a large retailer, right? What they realized and what prompted them to deploy Rocana was that they had an issue where they tried to go and figure out where else that issue may have impacted their systems and how they could best prepare and avoid similar issues in the future. How could they effectively identify something within the IT team that was going to impact the business before the customer noticed, or before it actually impacted the customer? And what they realized is they were looking at 5%, maybe 10% of all of the systems that were eventually serving different business needs that were addressing their customers. And so their first mission was, we need total operational visibility. We need to be able to, if we say, what's going on in business system A? Why are we missing SLA B? Why do we have lower throughput from a transaction perspective in one of our stores? Or why have we dipped in terms of user inquiries in a particular aspect of our mobile app? Why is that happening, and how do we identify it, fix it, react to it? Versus the present state for a lot of these companies is, until it's front page news, they don't know, right? They don't actually know that there's even a particular issue. So step one is just get access to all that information, get visibility into it, because you need it to serve sort of the timeliness and the revenue drivers of the business.
Right. It's interesting you measure revenue drivers, because that ties to really the understanding that so much of what we do in IT is mission critical. And the way I define mission critical is if there's a problem, it impacts your revenues or your customers, or generally both, right? So much of what you do impacts your revenues or your customers, right? There's very little that goes on. It's like, well, this system can go down and nobody's going to be impacted. That just is not the reality anymore. So it's important then to understand that from the business perspective, if you think about a business executive, may have been looking at a few key performance indicators. They'll be looking at, revenues per day, or, shopping cart abandonment stats, or some key numbers. And that's been good enough in the past, but now those business executives need more detail and more context of the overall behavior, because there's so much more to the customer experience than just a single number on shopping cart abandonment or some other limited KPI. So on the other hand, you have the IT people, and they've been looking at some of these nuts and bolts numbers in terms of SLAs and other considerations, and if they're not keeping their eye on the ball in terms of the mission critical information, then they'll be looking at the wrong things, right? They'll be fixing the wrong problems, as opposed to focusing on the most important problems, which are the problems that can adversely impact your customers and your revenues, the mission critical issues. So both sides, right? The business executives who've had that had their blinders on, looking at just a few key dashboards, they need to change the way what sort of information they're working with, the broader context of the information they have available. And the IT people as well, who may have been focusing on technical performance of the systems, now have to think about those mission critical business metrics, because those are the ones that are the highest priority. So you won't be able to understand the priorities facing you unless you have that business context. So both sides really have to meet in the middle and understand this broader context, where it's no longer just business versus IT, but it's the broader digital context, which is really the big picture of how large organizations meet the needs of customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And another example that comes to mind is when you talk about mission critical and the intersection between collaboration of business and IT and identifying sort of the bigger picture is the cascading impact. So you talk about the front page news, a slight glitch that meant that recovery didn't go smoothly for someone like Delta, which you saw this over the summer, right? Early in the morning, but the cascading impact of not being able to recover quickly, not knowing necessarily what the downstream effects are going to be, not having the systems in place to mitigate that, it took at least a week, if not multiple weeks, to get everything back on track and recovered and everyone rescheduled and the planes right. It was a logistics nightmare that they were not prepared for. And part of it is understanding how important it is to test those systems, to recover quickly from those systems, and to have systems in place that work reliably to address what happens in a worst case scenario. And so financial services is another great example. We have a customer that was dealing with this around Brexit over the summer, where there was a spike in volume of activity in terms of financial trading, and they didn't even know where to start analyzing it. It took them weeks just to pull all the data together because the process had been highly manual before. They didn't even have the data gathering mechanisms to look at how the systems were functioning and what transactions were flowing through those systems to even start doing any kind of analysis on that. And again, that's one of those prompts where you say, okay, do I want to be reactive once a particular issue hits me and I've made the front page, of the Journal or the Times? Then I'm going to go figure out, oh shoot, now I need access to all of this information I never had access to before. Or as you are deploying systems, be cognizant of that they are mission critical. Talk about it from a business and IT joint perspective. What are the cascading effects? How do we identify these things ahead of time? And layer in your operational visibility as you deploy the systems, rather than coming at it after the fact once you've kind of been hit and suffered from it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's interesting you brought up the Delta outage from a few months ago. I mean, the root cause, as I recall, was a power outage in some system, and they didn't have the appropriate failovers, or they didn't work properly. But the reason it took them so many days to recover was because so many of their personnel ended up in the wrong location. And if you think about how an airline operates, right, they have to have everybody on the crew in the right place at the right time, or they can't fly. And if crew members are in the wrong location and can't get to where they're supposed to be, then the whole system sort of falls apart, because now the planes can't fly, so you can't get the crew in the right place, and as a result the problem continues. So that's the cascading effect you're talking about, and it's a mission critical business problem that is indirectly related to the underlying cause, right? Simply because your reservation system goes down, if you're only focused, if your job is keeping that reservation system up, you may not be thinking about your personnel systems, even though connected, right, in terms of the broader business processes needed to run the airline. So and that's true in in broader examples. It's not just an airline example.
Yeah, we had this with another customer in the telecommunications space, where you frequently have issues where there are call quality problems, right? And those call quality problems could be related to handsets, they could be software defects, either on the handset or within the carrier's gear. They could be congestion-related problems. They could be backhaul related problems, right? It's a very complex network when you think about, even this webinar we're having right now, right? In terms of the number of systems that are interconnected in order to, and to make this so possible so seamlessly. When one thing goes wrong, connecting where that issue, how exacerbated is that issue, right? If it's one person's handset, you'll get a call into your call center. You get one unhappy customer that you have to, help them fix that problem. But if it's a particular site that's gone down or overloaded, if one goes down and others in the neighboring area get overloaded, if it's a backhaul switch, right? So connecting the sort of the customer experience metrics with the backhaul channel, whether it is in the case of a telco, sort of this net flow and IP fix, right, performance of the network, whether in the case of an airline in Delta, it's more the logistics of where are the planes and the people. What's that related impact between a customer has experienced an issue, and this is what the underlying cause is, that gets you much closer to how do we address it and how bad is it going to be? How do we mitigate it in the meantime while we're addressing it? Rather than spending days just trying to figure out where was the problem to begin with. Where do we even focus to address an issue?
Another key part of this story is the expectation of real-time behavior. It used to be that we as the basically consumers were used to technology systems having delayed gratification from our technology systems, right? Systems operated typically in batch. We'd have to wait till the next day to see if the money cleared our account or whatever it was. We applied for a mortgage and it would take a month, and we were just used to that. Well, today the expectations are now for real-time behavior, right? If we want to apply for a loan now, you can do it on your phone and you get back the thumbs up or thumbs down in less than 30 seconds. And now that basically consumers expect that, right? And if a company can't deliver that, now they are at a competitive disadvantage, right? Customers are going to move to the competition. So if you think about that from the business perspective, now enterprises have to rethink end-to-end business processes. And applying for mortgages is the classic example, because that involves many different parties, has traditionally been done with a lot of physical paperwork, and can take weeks or months. And down to 30 seconds involves so many changes, right, to so many different parts of the business in terms of their the processes, how people actually do their jobs at work, and then all of the technology that needs to support that. Keeping in mind that for this real-time end-to-end customer experience to work, all the pieces have to be in place, right? A single bottleneck will bring down the whole real-time expectation, right? So we're raising the bar on the technology at the same time that we're complicating issues on the front end, right? Because it used to be we just had the one computer. Now we have any number of different devices and we're carrying them around and we expect them to be connected, and we can do our mobile transactions when we go to Africa, and we expect everything to work every time seamlessly in real time. And the bar is raised for everybody behind the scenes, and without solving this context problem, right? There's just no way you're going to get real time to work if you have, your ops team doing one thing and you have your network team doing another thing, and then on the business side you have your marketing team doing another thing, and they're not working together and not looking at the same information. You're never going to get that real time behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. There's even an example that you think is brain dead simple. We take it for granted every day around video streaming, which we're working with a customer on, which is more of what do we focus on. So they call this the noisy neighbor problem. You have lots of sporadic issues. I mean, anyone who's watched Netflix as an example will have the occasional glitch, right? The little spinning wheel, or it's buffering, or the quality of the picture of the stream has gone down, especially if you're like on a long binge. Sometimes it's your network, sometimes it's sort of the local shared cable or shared fiber. But from a CDN provider perspective, when they know there's going to be a large event, when they know there's going to be, say, some live stream, what they want to be able to alert on is actually a very complex and challenging issue, and it requires some business insight and business input. And that is not all of their customers are going to be watching that stream, right? If you have, say, 10 million customers, you have a popular event that's drawing a crowd of, say, 5 or 6 million at that same time just from your stream. Those other 4 million may still be online watching other content. And so how do you make sure that there is the right level of quality in the primary stream without negatively or adversely, right, in terms of customer expectations, impacting the other streams? Given that you have limited bandwidth, right, you can only grow the pipe so much, you can only spend so much money on it. And so that requires both a business decision, what are the qualities that we need to maintain, what are the priorities, and a very complex IT sort of rules and orchestrations in place to identify contextually who is being impacted by what, and do we need to react to it, or how do we need to react to it? Because maybe your sort of dynamic QoS system is going to beef up a stream that isn't your primary stream because you've got a certain level of degradation, but it's actually impacting even more customers on the on the primary stream. So it's kind of this very complex thing where it's not simple, everyone should be roughly the same. It's you have a very specific business priority, and you need to be able to have all of that information about how the backbone is operating and the right, I'll call it sort of real-time alerting, real-time reflexes in place, right, to be able to link and say this business concept, this business SLA, which is not, it's not a straightforward rule, is actually being violated, and this is how we need to react to it to ensure we're delivering what the business promised. So seemingly simple, streaming video, but in practical aspects ends up being very complex to implement in these situations.
Yeah, and streaming video is in many ways an extreme example, right? That we're really pushing our infrastructure to its limits. It's amazing that YouTube even works at all, if you think about it.
Sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, obviously sometimes it doesn't. We should ask for our money back, right? So, but if you think about the broader enterprise example, yes, streaming video, streaming audio is a part of many enterprise scenarios. But even if it's not, the broader situation is this real-time behavior, which could be still data intensive, maybe not as much as streaming video, but the consumers are expecting a rich experience on every device, right? Whether it's everything from a wearable device all the way up to digital television and everything in between. So, and we're expecting responsiveness. We're expecting the device-appropriate user interface. Whether it's a touch screen or other kind of interface. And so, from the enterprise perspective, we have to support this digital diversity in real time, end to end. Keeping in mind that even though we have enormous front-end challenges with our supporting the various devices, from the enterprise context is that we're supporting those front-end apps and interfaces with the back-end systems of record, right? We can't do mobile banking without those round trips to the mainframe, and that doesn't matter how good that mobile app is. If you don't get that round trip to work, then you're not going to have the right customer experience. So all those pieces have to be brought to bear, and that's that broader context again, even just within the technical consideration, right? If you think about what does it take to get that, that transfer funds from checking to savings on your mobile phone to work, right? You have the app on the device. You have the CDN you mentioned. You have probably some third-party cloud providers involved, and then you have the middleware on premises, and then you have the back-end systems of record that are connected to the middleware via some sort of intermediaries, and all of that has to be fully secure, right, and high performance, and it's all. You also have the compliance considerations. They have to be PCI compliant and all these other regulations. And the Europeans are moving forward with even more regulations that impacting mobile transactions, and so the regulatory environment continues to shift, right? You can't count on it staying the same, and so all of that has to be work at top performance. in order to achieve the business goals. And the problems continue to mount. I mean, technology, IT is getting more difficult because it can get more difficult. We have better technology. Innovation continues to accelerate. There's such a diversity of capabilities that nobody wants to not use them, right? So we have big data. Let's do something with big data, right? We have the ability to do real time. Let's do something with real time. Because if we don't, somebody else will, and we'll be at a competitive disadvantage. So everybody is now being pressured to stay fully innovative, and not everybody is at the bleeding edge. Obviously there's some more conservative enterprises than others, but even the more conservative enterprises, you look at banking or the pharmaceutical industry, innovation is driving disruption is driving innovation in even the most traditionally late majority industry. So it's really impacting everybody across the board, which is really why this is such an exciting time. I mean, there's just such a diversity of disruption just across the board.
Yeah, and I'm not going to say there's a right way and a wrong way to innovate, but you certainly, in a recent blog post you wrote, touched around sort of the natural evolution of businesses to silo. And I'd be curious to kind of get your take live on this. So as people innovate, what have you seen as kind of and I'd be happy to chime in with my observation as well, but the natural tendency towards silos and why that happens, and then maybe I'll we can talk a bit about how to combat it. But I think it's kind of good to set the stage of when you're innovating. There's sort of things to watch out for. I'll call it, not a wrong way to do it, but natural tendencies to watch out for that can lead you down a challenging path.
Yeah, it's essentially a characteristic of human behavior that if you try to organize a lot of people to move toward a common goal, as we would have in any large organization, they tend to fall into a hierarchical organizational pattern, right? You have a few people at the top, and then you have the various groups or divisions or whatever below, and those end up being siloed because you end up with many different branches of the hierarchy. And that's worked well for us for thousands of years, right? It's been just an organizational or society-driven principle that's the way we've scaled organizations all this time. So what's interesting is when we start factoring technology and then the data that we are now able to deal with based upon the technology into this equation. So if you think about how organizational silos impact technology silos, that is essentially a pattern that we call Conway's Law. Now, Melvin Conway, he's a computer scientist that came up with this law back in the 1960s. He's still around, by the way, but it's not really a law. It was really more of an observation, and calling it a law was really sort of tongue-in-cheek. But basically, he is a software developer right back in the 1960s, right? And he noticed that the software that ended up being built followed the communication lines of the teams that built it. So if you were trying to build a compiler and you had 3 teams building it, you would end up with a 3-pass compiler, right? Because each team would build one of the passes. And so the technology followed the communication structure. But it's really just an observation. It's not a causal story. It's not a law in that sense. Where it gets interesting, though, is when you look at Conway's Law and you start thinking about the cause and effect behind it. Because it works both ways, right? If you have an organizational silo, you will, generally speaking, end up with technology silos, right? Each department will buy or build its own technology independent of the other departments, and you'll end up traditionally with incompatible technology from one department to the next. That's why big organizations have 67 ERP systems, right? It's like, well, why did you ever do that? It's foolish, but it's because of this pattern, right? Because you had a siloed organization, the way decision-making works, you end up with siloed technology. But it actually works the other way, right? If you have siloed technology, you end up with siloed organization. And if you reverse this and say, well, how do we fix this problem? Well, you could say, well, if we had less siloed technology, that would drive a less siloed organization. And that's difficult to achieve in practice, but if you think about it, that is part of the lesson of DevOps, right? DevOps is essentially a cultural and organizational shift that is breaking down silos, first between dev and ops, but we're also including the quality team and increasingly the product and marketing teams as well. So and security. So it's biz DevOps, biz sec DevOps. Because the whole idea is we're breaking down these organizational silos. Well, why are we able to do that now in the 2010s, and why couldn't we have done that back in the 1960s or whenever? Well, part of the reason is that our technology has matured to the point that the technology helps us break down the organizational silos. So better automation for the operations world, more mature open source, better APIs, and standard data formats. So all of these technological advances that are breaking down technology silos, where you can take a variety of open source tools and expect them to work well together, right? Because they're all following standard RESTful APIs, and the underlying code follows now broadly accepted best practices. So you're not going to find 5 different open source projects in the enterprise space that are following completely different ways of building software anymore, right? We sort of have this general understanding of how best to build this stuff. And yes, they're using different languages as appropriate, but you still have a lot of commonality. And the commonality for the data formats is equally important. Right, back in the day, it didn't matter, right? If you had 5 different departments using 5 different technologies to solve 5 different problems, they could all use 5 different proprietary data formats for everything they're doing, and it didn't make any difference. Well, then we went through this whole challenge in the 2000s. Well, how do we sort of integrate everything, and how do we build services that abstract all this stuff, and found that it was really difficult to do because our legacy environment was so siloed. And now in the 2010s, we're saying, well, wait a minute, we can learn these lessons of the past if we start by saying, well, let's have common data formats, common API formats, open source that follows the same principles for building and deploying software, and then we look at how we run our both our IT shops, so development and operations, and then how do we take those organizational principles and extend them across the business. We really do have this transformative change that is supporting these end-to-end requirements we talked about on the first half of the webinar, right? These real-time, customer-driven expectations. So we have this interesting, reverse Conway maneuver. We're saying, we're not a slave to Conway. We can use it to our benefit by saying, let's break down technological silos to help us break down our organizational silos. And that's it. We're getting that to work. So it's a great story.
So it's FinBiz FinBiz Dev Mark Ops. I'm trying to get all the different departments into one DevOps like.
Yeah, we need to get a marketing. Get a marketing person on the call. If you get a techie to do it, it'll end up with 12 different suffixes,
But on a more serious note, so it's technology, open technologies, open formats, open source is both or I guess it's all 3. It's the opportunity to be more agile and interconnected as a business, to move faster because you're not stitching together these sort of arcane proprietary formats and silos that we've succumbed to in the past because of Conway's law. It's also the problem because now that we integrate all these technologies, all of our business processes are integrated. We can't continue to use sort of operating silos once the business systems are integrated. And it turns out those open formats, those sort of open access to data, consistent access. So you're not replicating, petabytes of data into multiple silos. You have one, whether people are calling them data lakes or data hubs nowadays, but sort of one environment where you have regulated and secure access to open data formats. That's also the answer, right? That is how we get the opportunity to actually operate with context on everything that's going on. Am I kind of playing that back accurately?
Right. So you have this two-way street where on the one hand, a greater maturation overall about how we reflect our data, leads to more common formats, which helps us break down the organizational silos because we have this common frame of reference, right? A single source of truth. But it works the other way as well, that as the business, the competitive, the customer pressures drive this end-to-end digital story, we are now forcing our technology essentially by only buying and building the technology that gets this stuff right? So we're less likely to buy commercial software that has proprietary data formats because we know we need to have this end-to-end capability. So it works both ways, right? The business is helping us, is keeping us honest, right? By, of course, the business drives the money, right? And where the money goes is where the priorities lie. And so if our priority is end-to-end capabilities in real time, seamless for the customer, then the money will flow toward those products and technologies that will support that. So it ends up becoming a virtuous cycle for organizations who are moving away from legacy organizational silos and legacy technology, which is inherently siloed, moving toward this greater digital story. And what I find most interesting is that it's not just the startups and the web scale companies, the companies that had the luxury of starting in the 2000s with a blank sheet of paper, right? That's great, and you can make real progress. The interesting part of the story for me are the traditional enterprises that have been around, have gone through all of the generations of technology, have struggled with ASCII versus EBCDIC, right, on the mainframe, and that is still a problem for some companies. And you go from there to problems with XML versus fixed field data, and then you go from there to web services versus RESTful interfaces, and then so there's all this history, but we're making progress, right? It's not just repeating the mistakes of the past, but every generation makes greater improvements, and that's why we're able to deliver such great value to our customers, is that we are making progress with all of these things, and this context story is part of that progress, right? They were able to deliver end-to-end context for the business and IT working together as a single team, as opposed to having to divide them up into different groups, because that was the only way to get stuff done.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, we have.
So Omer, I want to interject. We had a couple questions along the same topic. Maybe you can address. So along the whole topic of silos, practically speaking, who are the key people in IT that can help champion change? Who do we find? And you used some examples earlier, but who are the folks that are most important or driving it from IT side?
I think ultimately, it's a great question, right? On where this change is going to come from. Ultimately, it's driven by the CIO. Angela Yoakum's on our board. She's the CEO of Rent-A-Center, right? She's written prolifically about the need for, at the executive level, the most senior IT person in the company, to have a deep understanding of the business needs and that mandate that they can convey to their team, because you don't have opportunities for someone who is, say, a network admin or a database admin, right, to say, I want to start gathering context from everywhere. It's got to be done at a level where you actually are answering the complete needs of the business, not a particular siloed need. So I think it's driven from the CIO down. That said, what we found most successful is where the CIO is empowering parts of the organization to break the natural silos. So, for example, we have two folks we're working with in the banking community. One is kind of realizing the trouble they're in from a database audit, database access, audit, and compliance perspective. They've got tens of thousands of databases out there. They're all statically configured. There is a central team responsible for it, but that team doesn't answer to the audit and risk part of the business. And so there's a request now, very reactive, to collect all the access logs from all these systems and be able to audit them. What they haven't thought through is now that you have a centralized view of all access, that itself needs to be secured, right? That itself also becomes sort of an exposed part of the system. It's also a database. And so they're kind of building this on, and it's really in this case, the CTO that's driving that and saying, we need to go through this change and we need to figure it out. That's kind of very reactive. On the proactive side, another bank has embraced sort of this growth in databases. They see what's happened in the cloud, and they said, you know what, we're actually going to provide effectively database as a service. So rather than filing a ticket, calling someone up and saying, I need to spin up, a new Oracle database or a new SQL Server system, they've kind of built in APIs and orchestration for the whole thing. So you get sort of this dynamic enterprise grade sort of database provisioning, management, and orchestration, and they've built auditing in, right? And this was because, again, the CTO in this case said, we need the service and we need it enterprise grade. You have the authority to collect all of the data you need and implement the interfaces appropriately to deliver the service to the business. And you're not restricted to, only using the enterprise manager for Oracle or the SQL Server monitoring, or right, you're not restricted to doing this the classic way in silos. So we avoid what that first customer is struggling with right now, which is that they now have this proliferation that they didn't control and didn't have responsibility for the audit of access to that, and the CTO is now mandating it. So both cases kind of top-down mandate, but two different approaches to how the team at kind of the MD and the VP level have taken responsibilities.
Yeah, I would add that yes, a top-down mandate is very important. I mentioned that activity takes place where the money flows, right? And so the money, the top management basically decides what is important for the organization to invest in. But executives have to be wary that they can't manage their organizations following traditional hierarchical approaches that may have been the way they've run their organization since the beginning of their careers, and the way their bosses have earlier in their career. So it may be the only model they're familiar with is this hierarchical delegation based model of authority. You can't simply delegate to your teams, say, okay, you folks do DevOps. That's not the way DevOps works, right? DevOps is essentially a self-organization based approach to organizing activity across the IT shop. And self-organization is something that we're familiar with in the software world because it was part of the Agile Manifesto, right? Agile Manifesto called upon self-organizing teams. Now, in the context of Agile development, those self-organizing teams are the classic two-pizza teams, right? Up to about 8 people, and they basically figure out how to divide up the responsibilities. They're working on the backlog as a team, and as opposed to having a project manager, say, assigning tasks, the team decides on their own, and that's a more effective way of dealing with a dynamic environment and building good software within that environment. What we're doing with DevOps is we're saying, well, let's take that self-organization and figure out ways to expand it beyond those two-pizza teams. How do we empower our organizations to figure out how to solve problems across the organization in a way that is not traditionally hierarchical, but rather people rise to the occasion, and there's a lot of progress being made across the world on how to get this self-organization to scale. So if you look at the holacracy that Zappos has pioneered, that's one way of doing it, but there's no rule that says you have to do it that way, right? Or WL Gore, they're an apparel manufacturer. They've been doing this for years, sort of quietly, but they don't have any managers there, right? It's basically people make their own assignments, and they've been doing that for years and gotten it to work for them. But it doesn't mean you have to follow any particular organization's approach, right? Because every organization is different, and it has to be bottom up, in that the individual contributors are organizing themselves by working with other people in the organization to solve the problems that the organization faces. The challenge now is, how do we scale that? How do we take a large organization and say, well, we're going to self-organize. We're going to be more horizontal. We're taking out layers of management. We don't need them anymore. We're leveraging better automation, better software in general, so as to support shifting of roles, right? We don't need to do manual operations anymore. So much of that is automatic, is automated. It doesn't mean we don't need ops people. What it means is the ops people and the developers are becoming one team where they're all doing all that stuff, and they're doing a different set of things as operations improves, as the ability to create software becomes more low code and no code. So you're doing less hand coding, you're doing more configuration. Well, that's not making it so we don't need developers. It's shifting what developers are actually doing, and we're changing roles, and we're moving more toward a self-organizational model. So coming back to the executives, well, what does it mean to run a company? That is changing. What does it mean to run an IT shop? What is a suitable role for the CIO, the CTO, or even the chief marketing officer, who is more likely than the CIO to be driving the digital transformation initiative? And all of these roles are changing, and the titles now aren't keeping up. It's like, how many CXO kind of titles can we come up with? Chief digital officer, chief data officer, chief who knows what. So that's reflecting this breaking down of silos, right? That we don't have well-defined executive roles anymore. So change is taking place everywhere, and it becomes difficult to really figure out where that rock is you can stand on that isn't moving, so that you can watch change around you. There is no such rock, right? Everything is changing, and that's part of this context we're talking about as well, is that the context of change across the board, technology and organizationally.
Yeah, how do you manage the transition, especially when now the entire executive suite is much more technical, right? They can dive in deeper, they can understand more. The bar is that much higher for people who are ostensibly responsible for technology. Becomes a challenge in that transition. And there's a lot of good advice out there on how to do it, and some great examples and some horror stories, of course. One thing that we've seen amongst our customers that's been invaluable is having an architecture team that is knowledgeable on good patterns and practices, right? So as different parts of the organization are going through this transition, it's not an all, everyone takes one big step at a time, or there's lots of little steps in each group. How do they compare notes? How do they coordinate? How do they facilitate? Oh, you're doing this, you're doing this. Let's combine efforts, or sort of buck the trend, right? Let's not do this as silos. Let's do it together. Having a strong architecture team, within sort of the technical purview of the company, that's teamed with the business, that can go out to parts of the organization and say, well, we're not going to tell you how to do it, but here are the patterns that we have seen work very effectively that you may want to follow in order to do it. We've seen that a very effective transitionary sort of strategy is having those architects knowledgeable, and they kind of, they're the drivers at the end of the day. They end up being kind of the day-to-day drivers of, well, if you're going to go, deploy a new system, let's make sure we capture all the context from it and relate it to everything else that it's connected to. Even if the silos are getting slightly larger, how do we at least connect the dots between them?
Yeah, it's great that you mentioned architecture, because I think the architects are critical to this digital transformation disruption that we're facing. And the role of the architect itself is being disrupted, and it actually has been for a number of years. I've worked with architects for many years, and if you think about the various types of architects we have, each of their different roles is undergoing transformation. So you think about a software architect, right? Well, now the talk is about how did they become more agile? What does it mean for an architect to serve on an agile development team? And that is changing the role of the software architect. If we think about the role of the solution architect. Well, that used to be, that's the whole notion of a solution architect was a siloed notion. Here we'll have separate solutions. These are individual, separately funded projects, and we need an architect on each of those. Well, that whole notion is breaking down. So what is the role of the solution architect? That's shifting. And perhaps most importantly is the role of the enterprise architect. Traditionally, an enterprise architect has been has dealt primarily with paperwork. They're dealing with IT standards. They're dealing with IT portfolio management, and it's been really more of a paper pushing role than a true architectural role in a sort of a more technical sense. That's really changing, and I see a revamped role for the enterprise architect really becoming this digital architect who understands this end-to-end challenge at all the various levels, the organizational level, the process level, the technology, and the data. Right? Somebody has to have that big picture and is able to connect the dots so as to facilitate the interactions across various people. And I see that falling to this reworked enterprise architecture role more than any other role in the organization. So the enterprise architect is not the old way of thinking about EA, but this new revamped EA role that should be hand in hand with the CIO, or even more ideally, the CIO should be this type of revamped enterprise architect themselves in order to understand the big picture of the digital transformation across the organization.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Lots of growth opportunity in IT.
And you just answered actually a couple of questions that I believe must have come from architects. One of which was, earlier we talked a lot about breaking down silos and events, and the question was, if I paraphrase, what do you mean by events? Is that logs? What is your meaning of events?
Yeah, I can answer that quick. I know we're kind of running down on time, and then Jason, if you want to sort of correct me on this, but we think of events as any notice of any action that can be timestamped. Logs obviously are events. Metrics, right? Collecting information about the operational health of a system is an event. There are business level events that are things like transactions. You might even think of events as being composed. A macro event, which is a session, is being composed of like multiple clicks as well as the network communication that happens in the back end, right? So there's sort of multiple tiers from user buys something and it gets shipped to them, through every single event that transpired down to packets were sent over the network, right? All of that has to go smoothly, to Jason's earlier point, in order for the customer to buy something and receive what they bought. Everything that happens along the way is an event, and is critical to have that context of all the events in order to make sure that you're consistently delivering exceptional experiences for the customer.
And certainly the architects are in a good position to see that, right? Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, so every event, essentially, you can think of it, one way of looking at an event is as a single database record, or a single record in some sort of data store. So the more events we have, the more records we have, the more rows in our table that we have, and there's the sky's the limit, right? The greater our capacity to store, process, manage, and move data, the more events we're going to be collecting. And as we move toward greater applications of the Internet of Things, we've only scratched the surface. If you think about what having sensors everywhere can do, where every sensor is generating a stream of telemetry events, there's as the technology continues to advance, as we know it will, we'll have exponentially increasing quantities of event data. And that now something that we, if we're smart, we come to expect, and it's exponentially increasing, right? It follows the Moore's Law pattern of exponential growth. So it can still get ahead of us, right? It can still move faster than we were expecting. But now that we're sort of realizing, yes, so many things follow this exponential curve, that we can, if we're smart, we can plan for that to some extent. Although there still remain disruptions as well that are coming that are harder to plan for. So, for example, the appearance of 5G, the 5G networks. We're on 4G and 4G LTE now. Well, 5G is going to completely change everything you know about not just mobile telephony, but about networking. And so what's that going to mean to the world of events? Well, it's going to blow the lid off of everything, and we just have to you know, the protocols are still in the works, but it's just going to be, and it's just a few years down the road, right? By the you know, the end of the decade, we'll probably see 5G implemented, and then by 2025, it'll be the default protocol. So
brace yourself.
Exactly, brace yourself. You ain't seen nothing yet.
Be ready now. Have a plan in place, or start implementing now with total operational visibility solutions. Because if you don't have the context at that point, yeah, you're kind of SOL.
Yeah, basically. Right. So it's not just about planning for any particular generation of technology. It's about essentially making change a core competency, making your organization better able to deal with the fact that everything is always in a state of change. And that's the broader agile digital transformation challenge that we talk about at Intellyx.
Yep. And step one is context. Step one is.
And with that, I'd like to go ahead, Omer. Pardon me.
That was just tying it back.
Yep. Well, we're reaching the top of the hour. I wanted to thank you sincerely, Jason and Omer, for a very thought-provoking webinar. And for those of you that joined, thank you so much for spending the hour with us. You can learn more at www.rocana.com in our resources section, and we'd certainly encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. This discussion about context and breaking down silos is certainly topical within our newsletter series. Thank you and have a great day.